In this exercise, we're going to begin drawing the house in perspective, just using the rectangle tool at first. But as we do, we're going to try to match some existing objects that I've created for you in advance. And the reason I'm putting you through these paces is because I want you to understand that you're not going to be relying exclusively on the perspective grid tool even as you assemble perspective drawings. Sometimes the perspective grid tool helps you out. Sometimes it just gets in your way and you're going to want to freeform. And that's just a fact of life. I've saved my progress as translucentpanes.ai, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom on in. Make sure that you're seeing the perspective grid on screen, and switch to the rectangle tool for starters here, which you can get by pressing the M key, of course. And I'm currently getting this No Can Draw cursor right here because the wrong layer is active. We're going to be starting off drawing on this perspective 1 layer here. I also have a perspective 2 layer set up in advance for you. They're both currently empty. But I have some other objects I'd like you to turn on. There's this middle stuff layer. Go ahead and turn that one on. And then there's this front stuff layer. Turn it on as well. Leave rear stuff turned off because otherwise you're going to block the template. All right, now with the perspective 1 layer active, make sure that your widget is showing you that the left-hand blue pane is selected. And then go ahead and draw from this bottom right corner right there up and over to the left until you get some form of halfway decent alignment going like that. And I'm going to actually take that a little higher because this wall will end up being covered up by the roof. And then go ahead and release. Now, you'll notice that the bottom edge is not exactly aligning to the molding, and that's because the perspective grid that I used for the molding was slightly different from the perspective grid I'm using now. And as any carpenter will tell you, the purpose of molding is to cover up these kinds of gaps. So if it works in real life, it's going to work just fine inside of an illustration as well. Now I'm going to go up here to the stroke option, click on it, and I'm going to change the weight value to 2, and then I'm going to turn on round joins for the corners because miter joins and the perspective grid don't tend to get along. All right, I'll go ahead and hide that panel now. Notice my stroke is active here inside the color panel. I'm going to dial in a rich black. And then I'm going to switch over to the fill, and I'm going to dial in a color here. I didn't create this swatch in advance, so I'm going to have to manually dial in these values. That is 5 for cyan, 90 for magenta, and 80 for yellow. And notice that that gives me a very bright red here inside the color panel. It looks quite muted out here inside the illustration, and that's, of course, because I have a blue translucent pane that's interacting with it. If that turns out to be a problem for you and you want to get a better sense of what your colors look like, don't forget that you can switch out that pane if you want to. But to do so, you've got to switch back to the perspective grid tool, which you can get by pressing Shift P. And if you're going to use the perspective grid with any degree of regularity, I suggest you memorize that keyboard shortcut. So Shift P to switch to the tool, then Alt click or Option click a couple of times on that little control there in order to switch that pane and that pane only to the grid view. All right, the next thing I need to do is basically get some better alignment going between this left-hand edge. My right-hand edge is just fine, I believe, if I scoot over there. It looks good. However, my left-hand edge is not matching up with the molding very well, and that's because I was a little sloppy when I drew it, I guess. So a couple of different things you can do. You can try nudging it if you want to, but nudging in a perspective view is not an entirely satisfactory experience. You can press the left arrow in order to knock that guy over to the left, or the right arrow to move it to the right, and so forth. Bear in mind that that's going to nudge the object along the grid as long as one of the perspective savvy tools is selected. Most likely the perspective grid tool or that perspective selection tool right there. If you have one of the arrow tools selected, you're going to be moving that object outside the perspective plane. If I were working on the ground level, this would scoot the object back and forth along the ground, so it would scoot it in perspective, not up or down or left or right necessarily. Also, this is a one-point nudge. Illustrator's perspective feature pays no attention to the keyboard increment that you've set up in the Preferences dialog box. And I brought up the dialog box by pressing Control-K, Command-K on the Mac. So it doesn't matter what this is set to, you get a one-point nudge all the time. So cancel out of there. Instead, what I want to do is I want to slightly transform this object. Oh, I should say, there is no alignment. That is, you cannot take advantage of the Align panel when you're working inside perspective. However, you can take advantage of Transform. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is lock down that right-hand edge by clicking on the right point in a reference point matrix. And then I'm just going to nudge this width value up and see what happens. And notice I'm just pressing the up arrow key and I'm watching this edge move outward. And at about 520 points, in my case, it looks great. So that takes care of that problem. And that is a perspective scale, which is good to bear in mind because Your general transformation tools, your rotate tool and your scale tool and so forth, do not work in perspective. So you have to bear that in mind. And I'll show you another way to scale in perspective in a future exercise. But for now, that takes care of our first wall. In the next exercise, I'll show you how to draw and scale a second wall on a second plane.